Do you want to see what's gotta be the easiest engine upgrade for your supercharged Yamaha? Stay tuned. Hey everybody, this is Captain Frank with the Ship's Log, and we are back in the garage again today, and I am going to show you what has got to be the easiest engine upgrade for your supercharged Yamaha. I'm going to show you how to install an engine breather upgrade kit for your supercharged machine. It's really easy. It'll literally take you about 5 minutes, and it actually is going to help your machine breathe a lot better. Now, before we get into that, let's talk about why we would even want one of these and what it actually does. Okay, so this is what the inside of your engine looks like. Now, just to let you know, this is not the cross-section of an engine from a jet ski, but the concept is the same. It's a 4-cylinder engine, which happens to be what I have in my Yamaha. It is a 4-cylinder, 1.8 liter supercharged engine. So, and you can see each of the cylinders, and of course, in here inside the cylinders is where the explosion occurs. You get that mixture of air and fuel that comes into the cylinder. It is then compressed by the piston. It's ignited by the spark plug, which causes the explosion that pushes that piston back down again. Over here, this part of the engine, this is what we call the crankcase. You know, you've got your connecting rods that connect your piston to the crankshaft, and the crankshaft is there. You can't really see it because of all this in the way here. But the crankshaft is there, and this is what ultimately turns. It's turned by the pistons, and of course that's what makes the engine spin. Now, down here in this area, in the crankcase, if you will, that's where your motor oil is. So obviously, on a supercharged jet ski, you literally could have RPMs between 7,000 and 8,000 RPM. If you have your ski modded, it may be even higher than 8,000 RPM. So this stuff is spinning around like crazy. So all this oil that's down here is just flying all over the place. So basically what you get is kind of a mist of oil in this crankcase here, which of course is exactly what you want, because you want to make sure that oil is getting all over everything and it's lubricating everything. But here's why we need this system. So the pistons have these things right here called piston rings. And the job of these piston rings is to basically seal off the cylinder here. So when you have that explosion in the cylinder that pushes that piston down, you want to make sure that the oil is kept on this side and that all of your hot exhaust gases and so forth are kept inside the cylinder until they're ready to be pushed back out of the exhaust. So now, of course, the piston's moving up and down. So these piston rings, they're not extremely tight, but they are tight enough to where they do a good job of sealing things out and also keeping the walls of the cylinder lubricated. So, but keep in mind, we've got explosions happening in here. There's a lot of pressure going on in here. So sometimes some of that hot exhaust, if you will escape past these piston rings and get into the crankcase itself. Okay, that's called blow-by. So you've got that little bit of blow-by that makes it past the piston rings and gets inside the crankcase. Now, once that gets inside the crankcase, it's got to go out somewhere. Okay, somehow, otherwise the pressure inside the crankcase it's getting higher and higher and higher, and eventually your engine explodes or hoses start popping off, or who knows what's going to go on. So at some point, as that hot gas goes inside this engine crankcase, it's got to go out somewhere. Okay, so what Yamaha has done, and actually what a lot of engine manufacturers, is not just a Yamaha thing, but what they've done is they've run a tube from the crankcase to allow that gas, that extra pressure, if you will, to escape back out. And what they've done is to keep in mind, as you said earlier, there's a bunch of oil mist
here because of all that activity in there. You've got it's like a spray mist of oil inside this crankcase, and you don't want that spray mist of oil. You don't want that oily hot gas, if you will, just spraying out anywhere. So what they do is they run that tube that goes from the crankcase, they run that back into the air intake of your ski. So that it will run out of the crankcase, goes back into the air intake, eventually gets fed back into the ski, into the engine to basically go back through this whole process again, okay? So it'll end up back inside the cylinders. Now, of course, oil is not gasoline, so it's not really made to burn like gasoline. So you do get a little bit of inefficiency that's going to result as a result of that. Not to mention the hot gas that is being recirculated. That's hot exhaust gas. That's not really good for the combustion process either. So yeah, you lose a little power, you lose a little performance, although it's not significant. Okay, but that keeps it from just being blown out into the atmosphere somewhere. Now, keep in mind, this is just with a regular engine. You have a supercharged engine. That supercharged engine, you're pushing a lot more air and a lot more fuel into these cylinders. So when you have that explosion going on in there, the pressure for a supercharged engine, particularly at higher RPMs, is going to be a lot more than it is for a normally aspirated engine, a naturally aspirated engine. So now, because the pressure is so much higher because it's a supercharged engine, or if it's a turbocharged engine or whatever, now you got more blow-by. You got more blow-by going past these piston rings. So now you got more of that hot gas getting into the crankcase. So now you've got to release more of that somewhere, okay? So now you've got more of that going out through that tube, going into the air intake and back into the engine, which again robs it of performance just a little bit. So what this kit does, what this air breather upgrade kit does, is it doesn't run it back through and goes back into the air intake. It runs it through to a filter where the filter can filter that oil out and then just allow the gases to be released. And that's the difference. That's what it does. So as a result, you don't have that that hot gas being recirculated. You don't have that oil going back into your air intake, which is going to gunk things up and so on and so forth. Just make sure your machine run a little bit better. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove this cover, what some people call the beauty cover. Doesn't really do anything except give the engine a nice look when you pull the seats off, and I guess it somewhat does protect it a bit from, you know, splashing and so on and so forth. But a lot of people actually choose to ride without the cover on at all because they feel it's useless. But that, of course, is up to you. But for this, we're going to go ahead and remove it. Two screws. And it is off. You'll see that there's actually a hose right here. This actually goes from the crankcase to the air intake right down here. You may not be able to see that in camera, but it actually goes and connects to the air intake. Now, this is the hose that actually recirculates those hot gases, that oily air, if you will, that's all bouncing around inside the engine crankcase. This is what actually relieves the pressure that's built up inside the crankcase. It feeds it back into the air intake so it can go back into the engine, into the combustion chamber. The problem with that is, as we said, there's oil in that air. Not to mention, it's not necessarily the most combustible mixture. So that's all being fed back into your engine. You know, imagine you breathing dirty air. Imagine you on a really polluted day going outside and your breathing is not quite as good. It's the same thing here. So that goes back into the air intake. It gets sucked into the engine, not to mention your supercharger, which could actually gunk the supercharger up. It can gunk your intake up and so on and so forth. Well, we don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to disconnect this hose.
There's a clamp here that holds that hose on. We're simply going to take this clamp and pull it off. There you go right here, just like this. Okay, now that we've got that hose off, we're going to take the filter that is included in the kit looks like this. That's actually going to go on to the end of the hose. And of course, that same clamp that was being used to clamp it onto the intake, we're going to make sure we slide that back up so that it stays onto our little filter kit here. There we go. All right, so what's going to happen now is as that pressure builds up inside the crankcase, it comes out through this hose and it goes into this filter and gets filtered here. And then the air, of course, can dissipate, but all that oil and whatever will get actually filtered out through here, will get stuck in here. So just the gas will actually come out through here. Okay, now the other thing we have to do is we still have that opening down there in the air intake where this hose initially connected. So we actually get, there's actually two sizes right here, depending on exactly what size is in your air intake. You simply take the appropriate size cap, you put it on there, and there we go. So once you put this cap on down here to cover up the intake where this hose initially connected to, you've got to figure out where you're going to secure this. Now on some of the older model Yamahas, it was pretty easy to run it right next to here, right above the exhaust manifold. But on this particular, this is a 21. On this particular one, I don't really like the way it sits there, and I really don't want it, even though I know the exhaust manifold doesn't really get that hot, I really don't want to put it on there. So I'm actually going to run it over here and secure it right here. I'm going to use a couple of zip ties. They actually included one with the kit, but I'm probably going to end up using 2 or 3 to secure it right here to make sure that it doesn't bounce around too much, and we should be good to go. All right, now that we've got that nice and secure, we are going to put our cover back on. Now, just to be clear, this is not something that's going to give you an insane amount of horsepower and increase the performance of your ski by some dramatic amount. There are claims that it does increase horsepower because of the fact that it's breathing cleaner air, but it's not going to be that much. It's not going to be like a replacement for a stage 1 or anything like that. So if you're looking for better performance, this is not the way to go. But if you're just looking to help your ski run better and last longer, potentially fewer issues, then this is something that you actually want to do. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope this was helpful to you. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And until next time, happy riding.